Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content.
A single locomotive flies around the bend with no cars in tow. The men inside frantically shovel coal as if their lives depend on it. Suddenly, a second locomotive roars around the bend right after the first. But this one is going backwards. It's on fire. And it's manned by angry Confederate soldiers determined to capture the fleeing Union troops ahead of them. This isn't just any chase. This is the Great Locomotive Chase. And Union soldiers John Alfred Wilson and Mark Wood may be tired, exhausted, and unarmed. But they've got to try something. They look at each other and resolve to jump for it.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larash. Pat, happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th of July to you too, Ben.
Yeah, we are... We generally like to think of ourselves as being a fairly international show, but today, on the 4th of July, we are going to celebrate some American badasses. And we have some really interesting stories that we want to talk about, particularly as they relate to the Medal of Honor, right, Pat?
Yeah, the Medal of Honor was the first and to this day, highest award for military valor offered by the U.S. government. It was something created in 1861. The U.S. looked at the British and said, oh, hey, you have the Victoria Cross. Let's do something like that for our people. And originally, it was simply issued for, quote unquote, gallantry in action. But over the years, the circumstances for receiving it have been really tightened up. And to illustrate this, about 1,200 Medals of Honor were awarded during the Civil War. But then when they tightened the restrictions in 1916, over 900 of them were revoked.
Yeah, and it's what you said. The Medal of Honor now, it has this very kind of sacred reputation as being the highest award for bravery. And I think, you know, in looking through the annals of the Medal of Honor, in many cases, the person who received it was killed in the action for which they received it. And talking about the revoked awards, you know, what ended up happening was that there was only one award for bravery, and it was the Medal of Honor. And, you know, around the time of World War I, the U.S. government created different awards of different levels. So you have the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star and the Bronze Star. And, you know, there's a number of other medals, and there's a tier of them, and Medal of Honor was at the top. And so they had given out so many during the Civil War that they took some of them back or lowered them to silver stars or bronze stars, depending on what the action was the recipient had taken. Everything that you mentioned is going to be relevant as we go through the rest of the episode. But what I wanted to start with was, very quickly, I wanted to talk about the most recent Medal of Honor recipient, because we're going to talk about the first one, and we're going to talk about the first and, to this day, only woman who has ever received one. We thought, hey, 4th of July, let's get 3 American badasses in here, and we'll start with the most recent Medal of Honor recipient. So as of the time of this recording, the most recent Medal of Honor was awarded on the 3rd of March 3, 2023, to Colonel Paris Davis. And, you know, with all of the acts of bravery and heroism that are taking place along, you know, throughout the United States military today and in recent memory, you would think that perhaps this award would be for Afghanistan or maybe Iraq or some other action that is being taken somewhere in the world right now. But no, it's from 60 years ago, and it's a Vietnam War hero was the most recent recipient, which is kind of interesting, right, Pat?
Yeah, sounds like it was long overdue.
So I want to talk about Paris Davis quickly. He was born on May 6, 1939. He studied political science at Southern University on an ROTC scholarship and shipped out to South Vietnam very early on, before the Vietnam War really kicked into gear. He was a captain in the 5th Special Forces Group, part of the 1st Special Forces, the Green Berets, the same unit that we talked about when we were talking about Robert Howard a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the first Black officers in the history of the U.S. Special Forces. The action for which he received the Medal of Honor took place on June 17th, 1965. So this is really early on in the fighting. The U.S. hadn't kind of officially been involved yet at this point, which may contribute to why it took so long for him to receive the award. But he was an advisor. He was there with 3 other Special Forces Green Berets training the 883rd Vietnamese Regional Forces Company. So South Vietnamese Army and just a couple of American advisors kind of training and guiding them and helping them out and, providing, oversight, but not really supposed to be too involved in the fighting. But what happens is Captain Davis, he gets wind that there is a relatively large North Vietnamese Army base in the region, and he leads the 883rd on a mission to take it. The situation is right, and he sees an opportunity, and he is able to get the drop on the base, and he makes the call to attack. And they attack, and he is, very heroic in the battle that ensues. He kills several of the enemy personally, including in hand-to-hand combat. He gets wounded by a grenade, but he keeps going. He captures the base, takes some gun positions, captures prisoners, reorganizes his forces, and then starts calling in artillery and airstrikes on enemy positions. So this very heroic battle to take this NVA base that outnumbered his own guys, but he was able to, through surprise and strategy, overcome that and take a bunch of prisoners, which is great, except that there were more North Vietnamese called in to assist, and there's a big counterattack.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So there's a counterattack, and now that he's taken this, he has to hold it. So North Vietnamese are attacking the base that he's just captured. He's shot. He gets into some hand-to-hand combat, gets wounded with a knife, but kills that guy. He's heavily outnumbered now and starts calling for evacuation, which I think, reading some of these accounts, like he was kind of hoping would have come a little bit sooner. Like you get in there, you hit this base, you capture the guys, you get out of there. He's kind of
as soon as possible.
Right. Yeah. Before they can mass a counterattack, which is, for whatever reason, what happens in this situation. So now he's fighting for his life. He and his guys, there's 3 other special forces with him, and then the 883rd South Vietnamese Army. They're fighting for their lives, and they're fighting for their lives for 19 hours, which is way too long to be on an operation like this. You're not supposed to be fighting for 19 hours straight. You were supposed to get in and get out.
You're not supposed to do anything for 19 hours straight.
That's true. Yeah, you got to sleep at some point, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, but somehow he's pushing through.
He's pushing through, and he's the commander, so he is organizing the defense. A couple of his guys, 2 of the other Americans get shot. Many of the South Vietnamese guys get shot. He's kind of like fighting for his life, and the rescue helicopters eventually arrive, and he's got to get the Americans out of there. I mean, he can't leave his own guys behind. He can't leave anybody behind, but he's prioritizing his Green Beret buddies, and so he throws one of the guys on his back, runs across like an open field towards this helicopter, throws the guy in the helicopter, and the helicopter pilot's like, all right, get in here. We got to get out of here.
Yeah, I'm imagining the helicopter blades are whirring all this time. The pilot's ready to leave. He wants to leave. He's poised to leave.
He's hovering, right? This is, I mean, you can kind of picture the Vietnam War era, think about the movies you've seen with like the helicopter blades kind of rippling the grass around him. There's gunfire coming in everywhere. And he loads that guy onto the heli and is like, no, there's another guy back there. There's another wounded American back there. I got to get him. So he runs back 150 yards across an open field being shot at by the enemy the entire time.
Whoa.
Yeah. Grabs the second dude, brings him back to the helicopter, puts him in the helicopter, and then the helicopter guy's like, all right, man, that was very heroic, but get in. And Captain Davis is like, no, I'm staying. I have to like organize the rest of these South Vietnamese, and we gotta hold this position. So the helicopter leaves, both those Americans that were put on it, they survived the battle. And Captain Davis goes back into the battle and wins it. So he lives.
Woohoo.
He's wounded several times. He's knifed. He's hit with a grenade shrapnel a couple times. He's shot a couple times, but he refuses extraction. He oversees the all of the wounded getting out of there, and he spends the later part of the battle radioing in coordinates for airstrikes until the enemy is destroyed.
That's impressive.
Pretty amazing, yeah. He continues through the entire Vietnam War. Like, the war's not over for him in 1965. He survives the war. He retires in 1985. At some point, he was the commander of the 10th Special Forces. He retires as a colonel, which is a pretty high ranking. It's the one just below general. And he received the Silver Star for this action and was nominated for the Medal of Honor, but for whatever reason, the paperwork got lost.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and then he was re-suggested for it, and then that paperwork got lost. And, you know, we were talking about this with Robert Howard a little bit, where, you know, there's a chance that it was like, you know, we don't want to give the Medal of Honor to the American who was fighting before the U.S. had officially declared war against the Vietnamese. There's some political reasoning behind this, and there's some, maybe he shouldn't have been, maybe like he wasn't supposed to be there, and that's a thing that, so... I don't know why the paperwork got, or maybe it just got lost. That happens. Paperwork falls behind the desk, and that's, you know.
Does, yeah. And we're talking about literal paperwork here. So.
Yeah, it's literal paperwork. Like, I don't know where my birth certificate is, right? Like,
yeah.
So anyway, a campaign got started recently for him to get that upgrade from the Silver Star to the Medal of Honor. And the campaign was largely from people that were there, like some of his guys that maybe not necessarily the three guys that were with him there, but he was part of a Green Beret base in South Vietnam. And the men that were there with him were like, this guy if anybody deserves it, it's this guy. So in March 2023, he finally received it. He traveled to the White House and got the medal put around his neck. And I'm going to just kind of leave it with his words. He said that receiving it, quote, prompted a wave of memories of the men and women I served with in Vietnam, from the members of the 5th Special Forces Group and other U.S. military units to the doctors and nurses who cared for our wounded. I'm so very grateful to my family and friends within the military and elsewhere who kept alive the story of A-Team A321 at Camp Bong Son. I often think of those fateful 19 hours and what our team did to make sure that no man was left behind on the battlefield. So that is the most recent recipient, Colonel Paris Davis of the Special Forces. And when we come back from the break, we are going to talk about the first man and the first, and to this day only, woman who has ever received the Medal of Honor.
Yes, and be advised, we are talking about the horrors of the Civil War, including prisoner of war camps and battlefield surgery, so consider this a content warning.
Okay, we are back, and we are going to talk about the first recipients of the Medal of Honor. And one thing that makes me really happy when we talk about this is that the first Medals of Honor were given out for an event known, Pat, as the Great Locomotive Chase.
Which sounds like, say, a classic silent movie film or something like that.
And I think they have made like plenty of silent movies about this event. Yeah, the Great Locomotive Chase, which is just like a great name for a historical event, especially one that is going to, you know, have such lasting significance culturally as this will.
So what is the actual Great Locomotive Chase?
Well, let's get into it. I am going to open with a quote from Private John Alfred Wilson of the 21st Ohio Infantry. He says, "Experience has taught me that man, in the fix we were in, is the worst and most desperate creature on earth, and will do things that seem utter impossibilities before their accomplishment." So that's how I'm going to preface the Great Locomotive Chase. The Great Locomotive Chase is the tale of more than two, but specifically we're going to focus on two Union troopers who went on a very high-risk, basically suicide sabotage mission behind enemy lines. They get involved in a high-speed train chase that crosses several counties and eventually states. They basically do battle with an entire regiment of Confederate troops, and they spend weeks on the run being pursued by basically every able-bodied man in the Confederacy. They break out of a prison, and they eventually become the first people to receive the Medal of Honor. So let's start in April of 1862. The Medal of Honor was originally commissioned and, approved in 1861. But the first ones are not awarded until over a year after that.
So they came up with the concept of the Medal of Honor before they had a specific person or persons to confer it upon.
Exactly. And they, had to pass through all of the paperwork and stuff. They had to make a congressional thing to approval to create the award. And then they had to approve it for the Army. And I don't know all of the bureaucratic details of it because, frankly, they seem uninteresting. But yes. I know that the first people who received it got it a year or so after it was created.
Okay. And here we are, April 1862.
Yes. So there is a federal commander for the North in the American Civil War. His name is Ormsby Mitchell, which is a really fun name. He is trying to capture Chattanooga, Tennessee. He is moving south through Tennessee in the Western campaign of the Civil War. The problem, however, is that Chattanooga is a pretty short train ride away from a couple 100,000 Confederates in Atlanta, which is one of the main Confederate staging areas, main Confederate bases. And any attempt to capture Chattanooga was going to be difficult because the Confederates were going to be able to ferry tons of reinforcements very quickly along the rail lines. And if you, as Ormsby Mitchell, wanted to take Chattanooga, you're really going to have to cut off train access from Atlanta. So he does a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking and decides that what he wants to do is commission a crazy spy sabotage mission to infiltrate beyond enemy lines and blow up the rail lines in Confederate territory.
Ooh, so cut off their supply lines.
Yes. Railroads were much faster travel than horses and using the roads and stuff, and really vital.
Anything else?
Yes, exactly. Really vital to moving men and equipment and ammunition in the Civil War.
So this is not just out of the box thinking, it's out of the boxcar thinking.
I see what you did there.
I'll be here all week.
Well, he needs volunteers for this crazy mission that he's coming up with. And one of the people who volunteer for it is a guy named John Alfred Wilson. John Alfred Wilson he's 29. He is a private, which is just kind of a rifleman from the 21st Ohio Infantry Regiment. He looks like what you would picture when you picture a Union soldier in the Civil War. He's kind of depicted with the little kepi hat, and he's got the facial hair that you would expect for a soldier from this time period. The photos of him, and there are photographs of him, they're all, that sepia tone, old style when the camera shutter speed was so slow that you couldn't smile for pictures. So he's kind of got this very serious look on his face, and, it kind of looks like, the photos of him kind of look like, when you see pictures in ghost movies, like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So he decides he's going to, the federal high command wants 24 people to volunteer for this mission, and he does. Okay. He signs up alongside another man from his regiment, a guy named Mark Wood, and they put on civilian clothes. They cross the border into Tennessee, and they spend 4 days traveling on foot through enemy-controlled territory dressed as civilians. They are looking to get to the town of Marietta, Georgia, where they will link up with 18 other Union spies at a train station. And their plan is that they are going to steal a train, ride it from Marietta up to Chattanooga, and wreak havoc on the train lines the entire way to the best of their ability.
Whoa. That's quite a plan.
Yeah, it's very daring and, like you said, outside the boxcar. They're known as Andrews Raiders because their commander was a guy named James Andrews. They are traveling, in groups of 2. There's 20 of them total, and they're carrying their 6-shooters under their coats. But they are, that's it. They're trying to blend in. So all they have is their handguns. They all board a train called the General at Marietta Station in Georgia. and their plan is to steal this train. And so this is, 1862, the train starts to leave from Marietta, Georgia. They travel for a few hours, and they, of course, stop for lunch because this is before dining cars, and this is just... it seems
you
like
just
a
need
very...
to stop for lunch.
Yeah, it's a very 1862 thing to do. You drive a little bit, and then you stop, you get out. There was a little hotel there that had a cafe. The conductors and the people on the train, they can sit on the train or they can get off and have a little bit of coffee or tea, eat some breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
So they're outside Kennesaw, and everybody gets off, and these 20 raiders, including Alfred Wilson, they get back on the train, they storm the engine, they commandeer the train at gunpoint, and they take off with it and just kind of jack the train and start heading up towards Chattanooga. And for the next several hours, they are trying to destroy the train line, to cut off the access for the Confederates to bring troops from Atlanta to Chattanooga. They are pulling up. I mean, their equipment is limited. They didn't smuggle explosives in here, and they didn't acquire any explosives. So their ability to destroy the train lines are not great. James Andrews at some point acquired a crowbar and was trying to use that to manually peel up railroad ties. They were cutting telegraph lines to prevent communications, but the best way they could think to do that was to just jump up and grab onto the telephone poles and swing on them like a Tarzan or something and break them that way, or cut them with
That would work.
Yeah, cut the lines with a knife. They're kind of doing everything they can to destroy this this rail line. They're not particularly equipped. This isn't like a U.S. Army Engineers Corps with bombs and TNT and all of that stuff. They're doing the best they can.
And they were undercover, so they can't really publicly walk around with a big truck of explosives.
Right, exactly. So they were able to smuggle guns on, pistols on board, and that was it. And so now they're riding up to Chattanooga, and they're executing their mission. They are, like you said, dressed as civilians, and they are just smashing and destroying and kind of demoing the railroad lines to the best of their ability.
Yeah, and the fact that they're in civilian clothing and destroying stuff, sabotaging stuff behind enemy lines, makes things particularly risky because at this point, you were supposed to treat your prisoners of war in a certain way, but you could execute spies. And if you see someone dressed not in a uniform, but in civilian clothing, i.e. in disguise, and if you see them sabotaging your stuff, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, the Confederates, if they capture these guys, they're going to think they're spies, which they kind of are, and they could very easily just decide to hang them.
Yes, and that is not, like you said, you are supposed to treat prisoners of war a certain way, but spies are exempted from the rules of war, especially at this time. So this is dangerous, and what they're doing is dangerous, and it's risky. They are doing okay at it, and this is where a big wrinkle comes into the Andrews Raiders plan, because the conductor of the general is a guy named William Allen Fuller. Fuller he's from Georgia. He is not a soldier. He is a train conductor by trade and has been doing this for a long time. He's got a big mustache. He is a kind of a hard-ass Georgia guy, and he does not like getting train jacked, especially by a bunch of Yankees. He decides he's mad when he sees the train pull off, and this guy is he's not going to lose this train. So Fuller, was out there eating breakfast. The train starts rolling away. He's running after it on foot for a while. And then he eventually transfers over to one of those little push cart things you see from like Wile E. Coyote would use to go down the tracks with it looks like a seesaw, but you just kind of crank it yourself.
Yep.
He hops on one of those things and is trying to trail the locomotive. He spends the next 51 hours pursuing the general, either on foot or by the handcar, and he eventually gets to another station on this handcar, and he commandeers another train that was heading south and puts it on the northbound track and runs it backwards because he doesn't have time to turn the train around. The Union guys are heading north. He found a train that was heading south. He found a few stragglers who happened to be from the 1st Georgia Infantry Regiment. There were just some guys that were hanging out. They were like bivouacked out there, and he's like, "You guys get on the train. We're going to drive backwards." He's kind of looking out the side of the train, going the wrong direction on the northbound track. He's very determined to get his train back. And he is gaining on John Alfred Wilson and Andrew's raiders because they are having to stop to destroy things. They don't actually know they're being pursued. They suspect it. They suspect that, telegraph exists at this time period. They expect that, maybe the
word
telegraph is going to... Yeah, word's getting around. They know they're probably being pursued. They don't quite know the extent to which that is happening. They're kind of destroying things and trying to especially at like bridge crossings, trying to do their best to block people from coming after them. But Fuller is on the move, and he is not deterred by any of the stuff that they've been doing to destroy the tracks. So at some point, Andrew's raiders, they see the train coming towards them. They see this train moving backwards towards them, and they're like, "Oh no, like this guy's coming for us." So they detach the last car of the locomotive. The Union soldiers detach the last train car and just kind of leave it in the track to block Fuller from pursuing them. And Fuller just smashes it with his train, goes faster. He's in reverse, kind of like a demolition derby, and he smashes into that detached train car. It bursts into flames, according to some versions of the story, but he goes right through it.
Wow.
Yeah, knocks it off the track, keeps going, and catches up to the train. I mean, the other thing to mention here is that Andrew's raiders are not, like, one guy knew how to drive the train, but they're not train guys. They're not professional engineers.
Yeah, they're messing things up guys.
Yeah, they're there to cause havoc and be agents of chaos. They're not experienced locomotive drivers. Fuller is, and he is like not going to be deterred, and he goes faster than them and he catches them. And those guys from the 1st Georgia, they have rifles, and they're opening fire on the locomotive. So our friend John Alfred Wilson, him and Mark Wood, they jump off the moving train to kind of escape what's happening here, and they take off into the woods. Some of the 1st Georgia guys are shooting at them as they run into the forest, and now they're on the run. And their adventure is kind of just beginning. So what to think about these guys? They're dressed in civilian clothes. They've got 6 shooters on them that in the time of the Civil War, it's not like a Clint Eastwood movie. You don't just pop 6 new bullets in there. It's not an easy thing to reload one of those things. You kind of have 6 shots for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And they're being pursued by everything from like Confederate soldiers to like civilians, like angry civilians, to like hunting dogs. Like everybody's looking for these Union guys, these spies and saboteurs who were wreaking so much havoc and causing all this chaos. Alfred Wilson and Mark Wood, they're running through the forest, and they get into what Wilson very funnily refers to as a ticklish situation, which is...
Understatement of the year.
Right, yeah, that's his term for being apprehended by Confederate cavalry and having the commander tell him that we don't take prisoners, we execute them. But he escapes that somehow. He captures a boat and takes it 50 miles down the Tennessee River, eventually making it to Union lines, or very close to Union lines. He bluffs a group of Confederate scouts into thinking that he was just like, a civilian.
Good work.
Yeah, and he makes it back to Union lines in Stevenson, Alabama. So, on foot, by boat, bluffing his way out of Confederate cavalry capture multiple times. He makes it to Stevenson, Alabama and Union lines. Except, turns out, Stevenson, Alabama had been retaken by the Confederacy a couple of weeks earlier, and he didn't realize that. And so when he walks into Stevenson, Alabama, it's a Confederate stronghold now, and he's captured.
Yeah. Because even though you have telegraphs, not everyone gets all the memos all the time.
Yes. So
awkward.
So yeah, 51 hours on the train and 36 running through the forest until he is captured because he didn't have the good intelligence or good information on what was going on in Stevenson, Alabama. So they're captured on sight. It turns out they were actually 7 miles from friendly lines, so they were really close, but they didn't get there. They are brought before the Confederate commander in the sector, a guy named General Ledbetter, and he says, we're going to hang you as spies. I'm sorry, you're going to be hung, and we're going to throw you into an unmarked grave. And Wilson is pretty badass dude, and we're going to see more of this soon. But his response to being told that he's going to be hung as a spy is kind of like the sort of response you'd see in an old cowboy movie. He says, quote, "Hang me and be damned. But I tell you one thing to remember. If you ever do come across one of our men and hang him, look out that sooner or later your own neck don't pay the penalty. Because this hanging business will be quite common about the time this rebellion closes up."
Wow.
Which I love.
Yeah.
I mean, if that was his last words, he would be badass. It's not. Ledbetter doesn't like it, but he does take him prisoner. He doesn't hang him on the spot. He throws him into, he takes them down to Chattanooga, the town they were planning on attacking. He's dragged through the streets in chains, and he is thrown into a horrible prison that is known among the prisoners as the Hole.
Yeah, and this is pretty awful. Being a prisoner of war in the Civil War did not mean that you were actually safe in any useful definition of the word. No one expected the war to go on as long as it did, so they didn't really invest in what we would consider adequate prison facilities, and most prisons were actually just giant, overcrowded messes, like the Hole, and you didn't have bathrooms, you didn't have reliable food, you didn't have reliable medical care. And two of the most notorious prisons of the war were like this: Andersonville in the South, and there the situation was so bad the warden ended up being hanged for war crimes. And in the North you have Elmira, where prisoners had to camp outside in the snow in the middle of the New York winter. And about 12 to 15% of all Civil War POWs ended up dying in captivity. That's like 1 out of every 8, or maybe even 1 out of every 6.
Yeah, really rough situations for prisoners in the Civil War. And, you know, the Union spies in the Hole in Chattanooga were not, we're on the lower end of the survivability spectrum when we are talking about prisoner of war treatment during the Civil War. So Wilson's thrown into the Hole, and he's thrown in there with a bunch of his other guys. So the rest of the guys from the Great Locomotive Chase had already been captured, and they were all kind of there waiting for him. There were 22 prisoners. There were 20 guys, 20 of the raiders, plus 2 other spies who had been captured that were on their way to Marietta to be part of the locomotive chase. They didn't actually get on board the locomotive. They got captured before they got there. So 22 Union prisoners. They spend 5 months in a 13 by 13 foot unventilated, unlit dirt room in the basement of an old building in the stifling, suffocating, airless heat of the Tennessee summer.
Ugh.
22 guys in a 13 by 13 room for 5 months.
Yeah.
Their chains were never removed. Their clothes became infested with lice. Their food was mostly spoiled, just cornmeal and rancid meat. And they figured that their lives couldn't possibly get any worse. And maybe they were right, but the situation does get worse for John Alfred Wilson, because 8 of those raiders do end up getting hung as spies, including Andrews, the commander. So after 5 months in the Hole, Wilson is transferred to a different prison. He ends up going to Fulton County Prison in Atlanta, which is a much better situation for him. Big improvement over the Hole in Chattanooga. He and the 13 remaining prisoners, though, even though the conditions have improved 20%, they still know they can't stick around if they want to get out of here alive. So
of course, yeah.
So they decide they're going to organize a prison break because they haven't had enough time being on the run. So they are going to break out of Fulton County Prison. That's their plan. And this is Atlanta. This is the heart of the Confederacy. This is the headquarters for several high-ranking generals, huge numbers of soldiers in the area. This is a stronghold. This is a major strong point for the Confederate military. They make their plans. And one night, when the guard comes to drop off their food, the raiders attack. John Alfred Wilson has removed a brick from the wall of his cell. And when the guard comes in to drop off the food, Wilson hits him with the brick, takes his keys, and starts opening up the cells. Now we have a prison break in the middle of Confederate-controlled Atlanta. Wilson has to fight his way out of the prison. He fights these guys with a brick. He's fighting with his bare hands. He has an empty bottle of whiskey that he found in a barracks. He hits somebody with that. He and the raiders, they bust out of the jail and they head off into town and they scatter in all different directions. And the alarms are going and people are shooting at them. And one shot hits so close to Wilson that the wooden wall splinters up next to him and he gets some splinters and some shrapnel in his leg.
Ugh.
But they're scattering and it's chaos. There's alarms. Everybody's screaming and yelling. And Wilson takes off. He ends up again with his friend Mark Wood, who has gone through this entire ordeal with him. And they start running through the woods while dogs and guys with guns and, like I said, even some civilians are chasing them.
Mm-hmm.
And they run and they make their way through the woods. They don't really know where they are. They don't know the geography of Georgia that well, but they're going to run for it. And they eventually make it to the Chattahoochee River. They decide, they're at the river, they're being pursued, but they decide something really interesting. They decide that rather than getting on the river and trying to go north, they are going to take a boat. They steal somebody's boat and they decide they're going to go south. They're going to go towards Florida.
And it sounds counterintuitive. Shouldn't they be heading towards the Union? But it actually is really smart because they're heading towards water. They're heading towards open water. And the Union has a blockade all over the place. So they're going to have Union boats all around. So all our guys have to do is get to open water and take advantage of that. And the Union blockade was a huge reason for the Union victory. They were starving out the Confederacy. They were blocking their supply lines. They were blocking international trade with England and other places. So, yeah, it actually was a good idea to go south.
Yeah, and it does pay off for them, we will see. So they cross roughly 300 miles in the next 30 days. So they're sailing downstream on a stolen boat for a month. They're living off the land. Like I said, they have no weapons or food. They definitely didn't, they got a brick and an empty bottle of whiskey and this boat that they stole. And they're going downstream in Georgia and Florida. They're scavenging farmland at night. They'll pull the boat up on shore and try to sneak into see if there's anybody living nearby and try to steal food from them. They're doing whatever they can. They start seeing alligators, which scare them. So the way they have to fight off the alligators is by hitting them with the oars and the paddles. At one point, I love this story that at one point a dolphin popped its head up out of the water and neither of these guys had ever seen a dolphin before or knew what it was. So they just freaking hit that thing too with the paddle.
For all they knew, it was just a funny looking alligator.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know what this. Yeah. I think if a dolphin popped its head up out of the water next to my little rowboat and I didn't know what it was, I'd probably want to hit it too. Big mammal, hit it.
Yes.
Yeah, and so after 30 days, they're half dead, they're sunburned, they're covered in mosquito bites, they've got scurvy, they've got yellow fever, they're starving, but they finally reach the mouth of the Chattahoochee River. And in the distance, they see the federal blockade, the Union ships that are preventing all Confederate shipping from getting in or out of the Confederacy. And so they have to make a canoe by the time they get here because at some point during their adventure, their stolen boat was stolen from them while they were sleeping.
What goes around comes around.
Yeah, exactly. And so they had to make a boat from, by basically just Bear Grylls-ing it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm picturing just like a homemade raft or a canoe or something. And they have to take that out on open water and out on the high seas. And they get picked up by a federal gunboat on November 10th, 1862.
So this whole adventure is taking about half a year.
Yes. So it's a long time. It was supposed to be, a pretty short little sabotage mission. They left in April 1862 and now it's mid-November and they have finally survived this ordeal and been picked up by this Union gunboat.
Whew.
They were the only of the prisoners that were being held in Fulton County Prison. 8 of them escaped, made it out, weren't recaptured immediately inside Atlanta. And of those 8, Wood and Wilson were the only 2 who didn't get recaptured. Everybody else was recaptured trying to make it back to Union lines. They all went north, which was what the Confederates would expect them to do, and they were all grabbed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nobody else was hanged. So they all of the others who were captured ended up surviving the war, or at least surviving this part of it. And Alfred Wilson and Mark Wood, they end up on this Union gunboat that sails to Jamaica and a couple other cool places in the Caribbean. And eventually he is returned to Washington, D.C., safe and sound. and is promptly imprisoned for violating a mandatory curfew that he didn't know existed.
Oh, no.
He's still in civilian clothes, and he gets there, and he's like, "Oh, you're not supposed to be out at night." So he's thrown in jail overnight. And then the next
story of his life.
Yeah. And then the next day, he meets Abraham Lincoln because they find out who he was, and he meets Lincoln, and he's personally presented with the first ever batch of medals of honor for his service to the U.S. Army.
Congratulations.
Yeah. So he isn't a guy named Jacob Parrott, who was one of the raiders who survived the hole, is credited as the first guy to receive a Medal of Honor. The original presentation of these was on March 25th, 1863. Most of the raiders were eventually returned to Union lines via prisoner transfers or prisoner exchanges. So the Andrews raiders eventually all made it back to the Union lines. And this guy, Jacob Parrott, had like the hardest time of it in prison. And all of the guys that were part of this crew decided that Parrott should be the first guy to receive the Medal of Honor. He had kind of taken a couple of beatings in prison and had a really hard time of it, but he lived and he got the first Medal of Honor. John Alfred Wilson gets his several months after the rest of Andrews' raiders because he was missing, presumed dead, and didn't get his, the actions for which he received the Medal of Honor were at the same time as Andrews' raiders, but he wasn't present to receive his medal until several months after everybody else got theirs. But, you get the idea. I like talking about Wilson because his story is, for me, one of the more interesting ones. And it is also because he wrote it down. He wrote down his autobiography. It's called, The Adventures of Alf Wilson, a thrilling episode of the dark days of the rebellion is what it's called. And it's great. It's really funny. And I mean, funny is not the right word. It's great. It's really good and exciting, and it reads like an adventure story, and it's definitely worth a read. John Alfred Wilson later rejoins his old unit in Ohio. He survives the war. He gets married. He writes his memoirs, and he lives to be 72 years old. And he is among the first recipients of the U.S. Medal of Honor. Yeah,
quite a story.
Yeah, Great Locomotive Chase. It's as exciting as the silent movies you'd referenced earlier, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I was thinking about it. There is a silent movie about the Great Locomotive Chase starring Buster Keaton, and it's called The General.
Oh.
And it's named after the
train,
the locomotive.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. It's from 1926.
Wow. Really early.
Yeah.
Awesome. So that's that. And if you want more details, you can watch the silent movie. I'm sure it's extremely historically accurate.
Yes. Or you could read Alf Wilson's memoirs,
which I definitely recommend you should do. It's very good. And so then when we come back, we are going to talk about the first woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Lieutenant Colonel W.W. Blackford of the 1st Virginia Cavalry describes the situation as follows. Quote, "Tables about breast high had been erected upon which the screaming victims were having legs and arms cut off. The surgeons and their assistants, stripped to the waist and bespattered with blood, stood around, some holding the poor fellows while others, armed with long bloody knives and saws, cut and sawed away with frightful rapidity, throwing the mangled limbs on a pile nearby as soon as removed." So, that's the situation I want you to keep in mind when we talk about Mary Edwards Walker. This is the state of battlefield surgery in the Civil War. So imagine artillery shells detonating, imagine musketry rattling nonstop in the distance. And this is all over the groans and agonizing cries of men who are dying. And while that's going on, you still get flood after flood of new arrivals into the quote-unquote hospital. But this is a frontline field hospital, so it's actually just an ordinary single-family home that got converted, got commandeered. The driveway's lined with horse-drawn ambulance carts full of trauma victims, and the, quote, emergency room is barely worthy of the name. You've got this just house being used as an emergency room, an operating room, and even a morgue. And we're on the outskirts of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the hospital's overworked, exhausted nurses, they They're trying to triage the wounded between those who were possibly treatable and those who weren't going to make it. So that's in Chattanooga. It's outside the city walls. The Union Army is pushing back to Chattanooga. They had been totally whomped at Chickamauga, and they're trying their very best to hold the city against this ferocious Confederate counterattack. And 46,000 men of Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee are on the heights. They're overlooking the critical strategic rail and communications center, and we know from the story of the Great Locomotive Chase how important those are. The Union forces are backed up against the Tennessee River, and now we've got an assault led by General George Thomas, rushing up a steep ridge right into enemy positions. We've got 112 cannons, there's murderous fire, and we're trying to break out of the siege. And, of course, soldiers get wounded. And those who were lucky enough to find their way back to friendly lines find themselves here in this little converted home. And, well, it is unsterilized. A lot of the men have malaria. The surgeons are using saws. And in some ways, the only comfort was a cup of cold water and the nurses trying their best to just say soothing things to them and ease their pain and suffering in some small way. These nurses were doing a very important job, and there were over 10,000 women working as nurses in field hospitals across the war zone in the Civil War. But Mary Edwards Walker of the 52nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry was the only one who served as a surgeon. She's also the only woman in history ever to receive the Medal of Honor. So she was maybe 150 years ahead of her time. She was routinely criticized by both women and men for her desire to wear, quote-unquote, men's clothing, which meant pants, because they were practical.
You don't want to do battlefield surgery in a big hoop skirt?
Why not? So, yeah. And she paid her own way through Syracuse Medical College in 1855, becoming just the second woman in American history to complete official physician training and work actually as an official doctor. And when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Dr. Walker had already been running her own private practice for 6 years. She's looking at the situation like, oh, there's a war going on. There are only 86 licensed surgeons in the Union Army at the start of hostilities. So she tries to sign up and offer her services. She was turned away by every recruiting officer she approached. So she found another way. Dr. Walker signed on as a volunteer nurse, and she worked on the front lines at the First Battle of Bull Run, and then later that year as an unpaid volunteer surgeon at Indiana Hospital.
Yeah, and like you said, it was pretty common for there to be women nurses, especially even on the battlefield, right? Even if it was just to like bring cold water and ice to like wounded men, or to identify people for the stretcher teams to come pick up. That was very common, but surgeons. A woman surgeon, the only one I know of is Dr. Walker.
Yeah. So her MO is, I'll just show up wherever people are dying and see if maybe I can fix them for free. She volunteers at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. She's performing frontline operations, and she took control of a medical train that was ferrying wounded men back to Washington. And her skills at surgery were so good, and her reputation was so good, word got around. And Union General Ambrose Burnside heard about this. He nominated her for a commission. And, okay, at first, Dr. Walker met with the usual resistance, like, okay, yeah, same old. But thanks to General Burnside's recommendation, she finally was commissioned as an assistant surgeon in the 52nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. She was issued a U.S. Army's surgeon's uniform, and she was sent to Tennessee to help treat wounded and dying men during the siege of Chattanooga as a surgeon rather than just a nurse. Now, what did the job of a Civil War surgeon actually entail?
So, like we said, with nurses, it's a lot of triage, make tourniquets, clean wounds, change dressings, things like that. But for a surgeon, It is very intense work, kind of as we've been saying with the quote you mentioned at the beginning and some of the other things we've been talking about. There's brutal wounds that are happening to people during the Civil War. You have artillery, canister fire, cannonballs. I mean, those are extremely damaging to the human body. And in a lot of cases, those kind of just kind of deal death, right? But the majority of the Civil War surgical cases were from gunshot wounds. The problem with this type of bullet is that it kind of mushrooms on impact, and it is heavy and it hits hard. And so it breaks bones on impact. It kind of shatters bones. And I mean, picture like a fluorescent light bulb being hit against a brick wall. Like that's kind of what the mini A ball does to the human femur. Perhaps that was too gruesome of a description, but that is how it worked. So, I mean, this is just rough stuff that we got to talk about.
Yeah.
You know, it ruptures blood vessels and organs and all of these important things that people keep inside their skin. And in a lot of cases, the medical technology does not exist to effectively treat these wounds. So if you got shot in the bone with a mini ball, sometimes the only way to prevent, and you're in this kind of situation that we've been describing, these very bad hospital situations, not a lot of sanitization happening, not sanitizing their tools, barely like just throwing a little bit of water on the table between patients. There's a big risk of infection, and gangrene is a big problem at this time.
Yeah.
With a lot of these, maybe they can dig the ball out, but that leg or that arm is not going to recover. The bones are broken beyond repair. And for some of these surgeons, the only option was to cut the appendage off. And you hear about this a lot, right? They say that, there's no organ transplants, there's no internal surgeries, there's no blood transfusions. They say that if a soldier got hit in the head, chest, or abdomen, he had a 90% chance of death. And you could just give him a little bit of morphine and water and a shady tree for him to sit under.
Ease his last moments.
Right. And wounds to the arms and legs, you had better odds.
Yeah.
But 3/4 of the operations being performed in these hospitals is amputation.
And if you got shot in one of your limbs, you had maybe about 48 hours to get that amputated with a hacksaw, which, remember, is unsterilized because people hadn't really figured out the whole sterilization thing yet. And as the doctor, you're working in whatever conditions you're in, which might be the kitchen counter of some family's home. And so standard procedure was that if you were a good surgeon, you could perform this operation in under 10 minutes, and you'd do it dozens of times in a row, bam, bam, bam. And all while the city is being pounded with artillery shells and stray bullets. And one nurse at the Battle of Antietam recalled working on a guy in the hospital tent and then having a stray bullet pass through the tent and through the sleeve of her dress and then kills the patient right in front of her, which may have been a more humane way to go. It was a pretty grim situation. About 25% of people who underwent amputation surgery ended up dying from infected wounds. And amidst all this chaos, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker continues to save human lives. And it's under hellish conditions. And yeah, the techniques are kind of barbaric, but she does her best. And she just keeps working as a frontline surgeon throughout the 3-day Battle of Chattanooga. So she's on a trip to Georgia to aid sick and injured civilians. She was ambushed by Confederate pickets. And they found her in her Union uniform. She was carrying 2 pistols. They arrested her as a spy. And this is a detail that may or may not actually have been true. We can't prove it either way. But her captors noted in their report that she argued, quote, enough for a regiment of men. They recommended sending her to a lunatic asylum for being a woman doctor, because, of course, that's the craziest thing anyone can imagine. And but instead, she was sent to Richmond and thrown into a jail for federal prisoners of war. She spent 4 months in the prisoner of war camp. You can imagine what that was like. She was then sent back to Yankee lines as part of a prisoner exchange. And she was traded for a male Confederate surgeon, and she confessed later that she was very proud of that trade.
Yeah.
Kind of gave her the credit, recognized her as, a battlefield surgeon.
There you go, right? And I think that surgeon was a colonel or something too, so yeah it's not bad.
Yeah. So she was sent back to the Union Army, and she was attached to General Sherman's army during the Atlanta campaign. After the Battle of Atlanta, she was appointed chief surgeon at a women's military prison in Louisville, Kentucky, and there she served until the end of the war. After her service, she collected a well-deserved Army pension. She wrote a couple books. She became a women's suffrage activist and got arrested a couple times for wearing pants instead of a dress.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to mention with Mary Edwards Walker is that we have spent a lot of time talking about like the gruesome details of Civil War battlefield surgery. But Mary Edwards Walker did not perform amputations. She didn't like it. She thought it was barbaric and medieval, and she was really against the practice. So she would do what she could to help people, and she was performing some surgeries, but she was really opposed to these kind of hold the guy down and amputate his arm with a saw thing. So she, there weren't a lot of other options available at the time, but she did a lot of work to try to come up with some new strategies, some new ways to treat patients, because she just thought that this was too brutal and too, like I said, medieval. And so I think that is an interesting detail about her. She was, you said before her time, and I think that there's a lot of truth to that, because she was really interested in trying to find a better way of dealing with these types of injuries.
Yeah. During her time in the Union Army, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker had been recommended for promotion both by General George Henry Thomas and also by General William Tecumseh Sherman. But she was not technically a uniformed service member, and so these requests for promotion could not be granted. But she did receive recognition. She was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1866. And over the decades, there have been 1.8 million women who have served in the U.S. military. She's the only one to ever receive this award. And when the federal government changed the guidelines for the Medal of Honor in 1917, they actually tried to go back on this and yoink it from her. They restricted the Medal of Honor by stipulating that it could only be awarded for actions that occurred in combat. And that's why retroactively about 900 people got theirs taken away from them. And that included Dr. Walker. And she didn't stand for this. She just told them to go get bent. And
no, I'm not giving it back.
Maybe not quite those words, but that attitude.
Love it.
No, this is nonsense. She wore the medal until her death in 1919, and it was actually officially reinstated by order of President Jimmy Carter in 1977.
So even though it had been revoked for 60 years, it's no longer revoked, and she is the only woman in U.S. history to receive the Medal of Honor.
Yeah. So that's our 3 Medal of Honor American heroes for today's episode.
Yeah. So 3 really good stories, American heroes, Medal of Honor recipients, just kind of very patriotic 4th of July stuff happening on the show today. And we are going to, we have something interesting planned for the next couple of episodes, because the next 2 episodes for the rest of, for the next 2 weeks in July, we are going to talk about some, I don't know, how should we say this? Less fondly remembered American badasses. Badass Americans, but perhaps not quite as patriotic as the 3 we talked about today. So, I think we're going to leave it with that. And thank you guys so much for listening. And we are going to see you next week with another one.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larash, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.